We know that these are eventually going to end up killing folks. I can't be any gentler on that. This stuff is not something to mess around with. It is not something that we can just dust our hands off and go home and feel okay about what's happening, because I know people personally who have not made it through this fight, and I will continue to know folks who have not made it through as time goes on. And there will be a lot of kids that are caught in the crossfire as well. But ultimately, we can only do what we can do. Like there are only so many things and ways to intervene that I can personally consider myself responsible for, that you could personally consider yourself responsible for. But we have to hold ourselves to those things. And I think that's really what I try to communicate in these conversations is, yes, maybe you can't stop that particular bill, but maybe you can make one less person vote for it. Or maybe you can change somebody else's mind on the school board so that when it's implemented, something else bad doesn't happen. Because when we all just dust our hands and go home, this bad stuff cascades, and it can cascade out of control because there are steps along the process, and each individual step you can, if you're a part of that step, you can intervene and you can engage in that harm reduction, and you can make things a little less bad. You can maybe save one person's life rather than just not doing anything, right? Like, and so that's what I would impose on folks, is try to figure out where you can be most effective in these processes. Maybe you don't have control over what passes in the legislature, but maybe you can stop some bit of implementation that makes something marginally better for those kids in that school. That's ultimately kind of my takeaway of my part in this process is, I know exactly what kind of impact I can have on this process. I know when to interject. I know how to make a bad bill better, or to leave it as bad as possible so that it eventually gets struck down for being so unpopular. And you all can do that too. It's not just a thing that lobbyists engage in. It's not just a thing that policy professionals engage in. It's something that we all engage in literally every single day. There are countless different opportunities to kind of nudge things into a slightly better position. And when we all do that, when we all kind of know our role in the process and know where we can nudge those things, things are markedly better. Again, there's a trajectory to it, right? And so we have to be nudging these things constantly. Otherwise, our opponents are going to be doing their part, and they're going to be nudging things in kind of the opposite direction. And if we don't assume those tiny responsibilities, I'm not even talking about like earth-shattering things, but just like you said, having a different process in terms of letting your students identify themselves rather than you identifying them. That's one of those things that I'm talking about. You saw that and you were like, hey, that's one little thing that I can do to make these kids' lives just a little bit better. If everybody is doing that, eventually we're going to get to a point where trans kids aren't dying at these astronomically terrible rates. I mean, that's ultimately the goal, is to get to a place where these kids don't feel like their lives are so miserable that they are engaging in these kinds of behaviors to try to end their suffering, because that's really what this is about. Trans kids don't commit suicide because they're trans. There's nothing about transness that ups the suicide rate. It's because they're being discriminated against every single day in every single interaction that they're having, and eventually the gravity of that has a really negative psychological impact on them. And so if you can take one of those interactions that would otherwise be negative and turn it into a positive interaction, well, that's a little bit less burden on them. And as time goes by, those burdens will be relieved by folks who care enough to take responsibility for their part in what is arguably a societally wide problem of discrimination against transgender folks, right? But we can't do that if we just shrug it off and say, oh, the legislature is going to do whatever, and so everything's going to be bad. Yeah, things are going to not be great for the time being. We have to keep doing those little things though. And if we don't do those little things, things are going to be much, much worse. They're not just going to be a little bit worse. They're going to be, I mean, like, again, just having that one adult halves the suicide risk. That's a big deal. 50% reduction in suicide risk is a massive number that you're not going to find in any other public health study, probably across the board, right? Those are numbers that are unheard of. And that's just like a little thing that you can do. You can just say, hey, I support you and I see you for who you see yourself as. That's not big, but the impact is. And so try to find those things in your life where you can intervene. Just look for them. You have to keep your eyes open and you have to listen to those folks as well, because they're going to tell you at some point that you screwed up in some way, right? Like I screw up all the time, and it's literally my job to do these kinds of things. But we're also kind of we're in the process of understanding who these folks are in the first place, and we're in the process of understanding who we are in the first place as well. I mean, I'm still in the process of understanding my own concept of gender identity and where I fit in that. So don't be afraid of making a mistake. You can always apologize, you can do better the next time. If you don't try, though, that is much worse than making a mistake. You just can't. There's nothing worse than not trying, honestly. And kids can see it. They can see the difference between an adult who is trying and an adult who doesn't care. That's very apparent. Even if the mistake is the same, there's just a valence behind it that is kind of hard to ignore. If you've ever been misgendered, somebody who just doesn't care at all versus somebody who's a little bit hurt that they themselves are responsible for it, that it comes across very differently. So I guess my message to folks is just try to identify where those things can happen in your own life, whether it's conversations with coworkers or whether it's evaluating how you're going to check students in a class, or evaluating what's going to go up on your wall, or how you're going to respond to somebody that posted something on your Facebook or whatever else. You don't have to engage in every fight, but you do have to at least be thoughtful about why you are or are not engaging. And I think that's maybe what a lot of us don't do enough, because our lives are busy and a lot of the times we're just kind of on autopilot and we're trying to go for the path of least resistance. It's helpful, though, to sometimes take a step back and think, okay, well, am I not engaging in this situation because it's the most beneficial course of action, or am I not engaging because I'm uncomfortable and it's easier to not engage? You know, actually think through why you're doing the things that you're doing. And especially when you're interacting with somebody like a trans or non-binary person that is maybe experiencing a lot of discrimination in their lives, I think you have to be extra thoughtful in those situations, and really think through, like, what is the impact here and how could I make things maybe just a little bit better? Because again, it's just the guilt and the feelings of helplessness can be paralyzing, and that's exactly what we want to avoid. If we get into this pit of despair, and we can no longer act, and that's probably the worst possible place to be, is to have that information and just be in a place where you're not even capable of acting on it, knowing things that are bad, but not able to take action. That's terrible. Yeah, that's a really long way of saying that even those little things that you're doing on a day-to-day basis matter, and they might matter the most out of anything else.